Live and on tape from the Silicon Valley, this is the Daily Disturbance, hosted by Dave Daba, ripping on players, coaches, and bad front office management. The Daily Disturbance starts.
Okay, here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Coming up on The Disturbance, we take a quick look back at the National Basketball Association draft. Look, I don't know about you, but out of a handful of players, I had no idea who the rest of the players were in this year's NBA draft. Seriously, who are these guys? Plus, we continue our ongoing look at James Harden as he fights to leave the Houston Rockets. We'll talk about Kyrie Irving and how he, as it turns out, doesn't want to play with James Harden. This has all turned James Harden into the National Basketball Association's first ever superstar who could be called a nomad. I've got all of that, and trust me, a whole lot more coming up on the big show today. I'm Dave DeBaugh. You have tuned into The Disturbance. It is Saturday, November 21st of the year 2020. And there is just so much to cover on today's show. Now, as you know, the Disturbance shows are generally pretty short. We try to knock them out in 10 minutes or less if we can. Let's go ahead and dive into the National Basketball Association draft. Now, up at the very top of the draft, we certainly recognized who the players were going to be. We did a brief pre-draft show. And when you look at the National Basketball Association draft, one of the ways of sort of thinking about this, and I'm based here in the Silicon Valley, I spend a lot of time working with technology companies. And I can tell you that when it comes to raising capital, when you actually look at the National Basketball Association draft, and if we go back and we look at years past, even the top 2 or 3 picks in the draft from years past, it's usually runs at about a 20% success rate, which is basically right in line with how startups actually succeed or fail here in the Silicon Valley. Now, only like a small little percentages of startups, like less than 0.25% of startups, will turn into actual massive home runs. You can say the same thing about National Basketball Association players who are drafted in the NBA draft in the first 10 picks. If we go back and we look at it, there is just a slew. All you have to do is say Markelle Fultz. Markelle Fultz, Philadelphia. So look, you just don't know what you're getting with most of these players, and that is the real reality of the situation when it comes to the NBA draft. That's why I said that when you actually get down and if you have the number 1 pick, what you should really be shooting for is who has the biggest superstar potential of any player in the draft. Now, I think there were 3 players in the top 3 that fit that category. LaMelo Ball, James Wiseman, who really could be the next Anthony Davis, and then, of course, the number 1 draft choice, which was Anthony Edwards. I had a friend ask me the other day, he said, who does he remind you of? Does he remind you of J.R. Rider? And I was like, yeah, he does remind me of J.R. Rider. Now, do I think J.R. Rider should have been the number 1 pick in the National Basketball Association draft after seeing his career unfold before my eyes? And the answer to that question is absolutely not. J.R. Rider's career justifies a second-round pick, if you know what I mean. So when I look at Anthony Edwards, who the Minnesota Timberwolves took with the first pick, I think, he's probably going to be pretty good in his first year. But is he going to be a superstar? Does he have that superstar potential? And I think he does. I think James Wiseman does, and I know LaMelo Ball does. LaMelo Ball is not his brother. LaMelo Ball actually is getting better every 6 months of his life. I think if there's going to be an actual superstar that came out of the 2020 National Basketball Association draft this year, it is going to be LaMelo Ball. And that is why I think the T-Wolves made a mistake at 1. That's not to say Anthony Edwards isn't going to work out and turn into a nice National Basketball Association player. Heck, I hope he turns into a superstar, but the odds are against him. Now, look, when you go into the lower portion of this, of the top 10 of the draft, there's just a bunch of interesting players, a bunch of them that you've never actually heard of before. I think one of the sleeper picks was actually pulled off, believe it or not, and I can't believe I'm actually going to say this, but this is the year 2020, right? I'm going to say that I think the New York Knicks actually made a wise choice for the first time in a very long time with their first round pick in Obi Toppin. I think he's a real National Basketball Association stud in the making. He is a solid player. He's got a lot of, if you will, Karl Malone in him. So I think that was a really good pick by the New York Knicks. That's actually going to create actual instant dividends, which is something that poorly run franchise in the best city in the world. It's just such a shame. It's such a shame that Dolan owns that team. Look, I don't know about you, but I'd much rather have Dolan own the Sacramento Kings, if you know what I mean. Let's get a real owner to own the New York Knicks who's actually willing to spend the right kind of money on the right kind of people to run his organization for him. Disaster, but they finally did make a good selection there. Look, lots of other interesting selections. I like the Suns taking Jalen Smith at 10. He's going to fit in nicely with that organization. He's another player that actually has been improving significantly. It seems like every 6 months he's on the basketball court. But if you had to pick a superstar, if I said to you, you can only pick one superstar, who has the most superstar potential? The answer would be hands down LaMelo Ball coming out of the draft. Now, the rest of this draft has totally changed. I actually, I have to say that I heard another show sort of talking about this the other day, and I have to agree. Watching this year's NBA draft was like watching the Major League Baseball draft. You know, like where you just don't know who these players are. Now, if you've ever sat down and attempted to watch the Major League Baseball draft, if you think you know something about baseball, you really don't until you sit down and attempt to watch that thing unfold. I mean, if you think baseball's slow, you got to watch the Major League Baseball draft unfold in front of your eyes. It is a confusing mix of a bunch of players that you've never heard of before, you've never seen. I don't care if you've watched college baseball or you've watched a ton of high school baseball. There could only be a small handful of players that you would recognize in that draft. That's just how it's set up. With the NBA this year, and since we didn't get any real college basketball over an extended period of time, we end up with even the second pick in this year's draft only played 3 games in college in Wiseman. What do we really know about James Wiseman at this point? I mean, we saw him play 3 games with Memphis. It is a total and absolute startup capital environment when it comes to the National Basketball Association draft, especially in these first 2 rounds. It is a hit or miss. It's actually a miss more than you're going to hit. In fact, I guarantee that there'll be more all-stars that come from the middle of the first round to the middle of the second round than we will get from the top 10 that were drafted in this year's NBA draft. That's just how this works. It is total hit or miss. And I'm telling you right now, like a lot of these startups that get that initial capital here in the Silicon Valley who don't make it, that's what this NBA draft was really like. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen in the NBA before. And obviously, I think COVID certainly played a huge role in that, just because we didn't have a chance to see any of these players really in any extensive way. I do also want to point out that, at this stage, the anticipation that we had for Zion Williamson, and as much as I sort of play up that I think LaMelo Ball could be a huge superstar in the NBA, they are starting at different levels entering their rookie season. The expectations on LaMelo are completely different than the expectations that Zion had last year. The shoulders of the National Basketball Association future was put on Zion's shoulders last year. That will not be the case with LaMelo this year. It is a interesting note, if you will. Look, the NBA ratings are down. The NHL ratings are down. The Masters had the worst ratings they've had since color television was invented. People are not tuning in the way they used to, which is ironic because they're actually supposed to be at home social distancing. So there's definitely been a shift in how we watch our sports, how much of it we consume. There's certainly been a huge uptick in sports media, but in terms of in terms of actually sitting down and watching an entire game, the NBA has seen a gradual decline in its ratings over the last 5 years. And politics aside, because it's really not about the politics of it. Look, the NHL doesn't have any politics, do they? What sort of politics existed with this year's Masters for them to have such poor ratings? I mean, of course, it happened in November and it wasn't in April, but still. And it's not like Tiger wasn't playing over the weekend at this year's Masters anyways. So we have that. So real quick, I do want to touch on James Harden before we get out of here. I know we've gone past our 10 minutes at this point, but stick with me here just for a second. Now, James Harden, when we last spoke, James Harden was close to becoming a New York or a Brooklyn Net. He was so close. It was very close from what I understand. Very, very close. But apparently, Kyrie Irving sort of jumped in and said, I don't want, and this is a alleged story. We haven't actually seen Kyrie come out and say this. But allegedly, Kyrie said he didn't want to play with James Harden. So can you imagine, like, Kyrie sitting there and he's like, okay, I've got Kevin Durant here. I've got a bunch of other really nice players. I can go out and get James Harden, who can put up 30 a night, and I don't want to play with that guy. What does that tell you about Kyrie Irving? And what does that tell you about the Nets organization as a whole? Look, I know Steve Nash is there, and he's gonna do a fine job as a head coach in the National Basketball Association. But if you're the Nets, here's an idea for you. Why not trade Kyrie off of your team to Houston and get James Harden in exchange and pair Harden with KD and see what happens? Because trust me, I'm going to tell you this right now. The 30 games that you get Kyrie to play next year might not be worth all of the off-the-court shenanigans that you're going to have to deal with that guy. 100% talented. If he can play the last 30 games of the year and play in the playoffs, that's best case scenario for you if you're a Nets fan. But the reality is, and you just know, and I'm not wishing this, but you just know this is going to happen. He's going to miss a large portion of the season. By the time the playoffs start, he's going to come back, and he's not going to be 100% healthy, and that's going to be a problem. And KD's not even going to find a way to get himself out of the East. So, do they need Harden? Would Harden be a benefit to the Brooklyn Nets, especially with a guy that knows how this all works in Steve Nash? And the answer is absolutely yes. If you've got a superstar like Kyrie that doesn't want him on your team, I say ship him out. As for the rest of the NBA, as the rest of the NBA is sort of starting to look at this James Harden nomad superstar sort of in this strange spot where there's really only a small handful of teams that James Harden would actually probably want to join, because they actually have a chance at winning a ring, which is what James Harden's all about. So for James Harden to be like traded to the Chicago Bulls right now, or the Minnesota Timberwolves, or dare I say, even the Denver Nuggets, who have a far better team than those two other teams I just mentioned, he probably wouldn't want to go there in the first place. He just wants to win a title, and you can't really knock the guy for that. His best chance to win a title is probably simply going to be to stay put. But how upset at an organization do you need to be to turn down over $100 million to stay there? It is a really good question to ask. All right. That's it for the disturbance today on Saturday, November 21st of the year 2020. If you have a chance, do check out our big website at mighty.rip. Also, our YouTube channel has the latest and greatest from the Gods of Odds National Football League podcast, so you can get your NFL picks there. And on a final note, our merch store, we have solved our merchandising distribution issues, so our merch store is back up. And if you are a basketball fan, I do have to say there's some really unique, cool basketball gear on the Mighty Rip merch section of the site. All right, enough shameless plugs for you. For the disturbance, I am Dave DeBaugh, wishing you all a tremendous rest of your sports week.